The morning began as always, with noise outside the windows and the aroma of coffee, which I could smell without even leaving my room. Dad was always the first to wake up, loudly discussing with Mom what they needed to take with them for the trip and which roads they'd take. These were such ordinary morning conversations that they felt like a part of everything: life, home, my world. But this time, something was different. I stood by the slightly open kitchen door, as if hesitant to step in, or maybe just trying to slow time down. Mom and Dad were preparing for a weekend away, and their plans always meant one thing. They were leaving, and we were staying behind. I always felt a slight sense of relief when they weren't around. No pressure, no responsibilities, just peace and freedom. But today, I didn't feel that lightness. Instead, there was a heaviness in my chest, as though this day, this moment, was more important than usual, and I couldn't understand why. My stepbrother Daniel, usually brimming with energy and endless questions, stood silently by the window, gazing out onto the street. He wasn't chiming in on our parents' conversations, as he usually would. I saw his shadow flicker on the kitchen walls but didn't pay much attention to it. It wasn't unusual. He always seemed to dwell in his own world, his own shadow, and I never noticed how it had started to overshadow everything else. We weren't close, and perhaps that's why I felt like I could comfortably stay in the background, avoiding their conversations and plans. "We'll go to Grandma's, so everything should be fine," Mom said, almost ready to walk out the door, still oblivious to Daniel, who remained standing with a cup of coffee in his hands, lost in thought. When my parents left, the silence in the house felt almost too loud. Usually I'd use this time to work, diving into a project that mattered to me more than anything else. I'd shut my bedroom door, play some background music, and layer chart after chart without thinking too much about it. It was my space, my usual routine, where no one interfered. But today was different. I sat at my desk, glanced at my laptop screen, and realized I couldn't focus. My mind seemed to drift away from work, as if I were trapped in thoughts that refused to leave. Everything had started as usual, but soon I noticed my hand slipping off the mouse. A laugh echoed in my ears. It was Daniel. He had entered the room without knocking and stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee, watching me with that familiar, smug expression on his face. "You never take a break? Even on weekends?" he asked, as though his question was some casual remark. But his laughter cut through me, jolting me out of my thoughts. I felt my face tense up immediately, though I tried not to show it. My hand moved back to the keyboard, trying to return to work. "I need to finish this project," I replied without looking up. "I don't need a break," I said, though I immediately realized it wasn't true. I couldn't even explain to myself why this feeling was gnawing at me so insistently. Daniel laughed again, but there was something different about it. Something I couldn't quite place. "Are you sure?" he asked, still not leaving. I felt my thoughts start to spiral again. At some point, I just said, "Yes, I'm sure," and turned back to the screen. But as his footsteps receded, I realized I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. This wasn't just another morning, not just another conversation with my brother. The day was shifting, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to return to work, but the thoughts wouldn't come. Every time I looked at my laptop screen, it seemed as though the numbers and charts danced before my eyes, growing increasingly abstract, increasingly distant. I began to feel how every brief moment away from the project pulled me further from any sense of normalcy. That's when I sensed him approaching. He entered the room again, but this time his steps were cautious, almost imperceptible, as if he didn't want to break the silence. I didn't pay attention at first. I didn't even look up. But Daniel didn't leave. He sat down across from me in the chair that was usually empty. I kept my gaze fixed on the screen, but I could feel his presence nearby, growing, almost tangible, as if he were trying to invade my space. "You're always alone," he said, and there was something strange in his voice, something almost personal. Daniel had never been this serious. I turned to meet his gaze. He wasn't laughing. There was something new in his eyes, something I couldn't decipher. I felt a jolt in my chest. I'm not alone, I replied, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. I have my work. I couldn't figure out what he truly wanted. Are you afraid of losing something? His question caught me off guard. I felt it sink in, touching something deep inside, something I'd long tried to keep hidden. I'm not afraid, I said, but I didn't believe my own words. I closed the laptop, trying to calm the wave of anxiety rising in me, but it wouldn't go away. He sat there, silent, as if once again forcing me to confront what was happening in my own mind. I felt his gaze reach deeper than usual, and a new kind of fear crept in. The unbearable fear that in this silence, he might have discovered more about me than I was willing to reveal. The evening began with familiar sounds. Voices outside the window, the distant beams of car headlights flickering across the walls, and the kettle whistling softly in the kitchen. I sat at my desk, trying to focus on the project that hadn't progressed an inch during the day. Everything was quiet and peaceful, except for the storm of thoughts raging inside me. Usually, when my parents were away, the house settled into a calm emptiness. I cherished those moments. I could work undisturbed, and I always liked the feeling of being in charge of my own time. But now, thoughts of Daniel wouldn't leave me. His questions, his surprisingly calm voice, the look in his eyes that held something elusive, they all lingered in my mind. Why had he chosen this moment to study me so intently? What was he trying to uncover? And most unsettling of all, why did it suddenly matter so much to me what he thought? I tried to take a sip of my now cold tea, but the taste was bitter and unpleasant. Closing my laptop, I stood up and paced the room. The sounds outside grew sharper. Children shouting about a new game in the distance, someone chopping wood, the cracks of it echoing through the streets. The light in the living room flickered faintly, left on by my parents. They often forgot to turn off the small lamp before leaving. This space, this time, had always been my refuge. The kitchen at night, when the soft glow of the lamps cast gentle shadows on every object, usually brought me peace. But now, sitting across from him, I felt the walls, once familiar and comforting, grow alien. It seemed as though every object, the chair, the table, my half-empty tea, took on a different meaning, reflecting the tension that filled the room. Were you trying to work? He asked, his voice subdued, almost sympathetic. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I didn't want to lie, but telling the truth felt dangerous. The truth was that my thoughts wouldn't leave me alone, that his presence was unraveling my focus, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I brought you some tea, he said, softer this time. He carefully placed a cup in front of me, and the scent of jasmine filled the room. I felt a conflict brewing inside me. On one hand, his gesture seemed kind, almost touching. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was provoking me. With his questions, his presence, and the charged closeness between us. Do you always live by a schedule? He asked, an unexpected question tinged with genuine curiosity. I stared at the cup of tea, trying to push away the intrusive thoughts, and merely nodded. Yes, I always clung to a schedule. My life felt stable and predictable, at least until he disrupted it with his strange inquiries. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. What do you do when the plan falls apart? He looked me directly in the eyes, and in his gaze I saw something I couldn't grasp. Was it a challenge, compassion, or perhaps a spark that threatened to ignite something much larger? I didn't know how to answer. In that moment, the carefully constructed image of myself as a confident, self-assured person in control of her life began to waver. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Maybe I really didn't know how to cope when things slipped beyond my control. The silence between us thickened, like a taut, invisible string stretched tight. The children's voices outside had stopped. The living room light seemed dimmer, and the cup of tea he'd placed before me felt like the only steady point in the room. I looked at him and found myself unable to look away. The discomfort inside me grew, and I desperately searched for an explanation, but everything felt too vague. And the most frightening part was the realization that even he didn't seem entirely sure of what he was doing. but that only deepened his curiosity about me. I exhaled, trying to steady my voice, but said nothing. And in that moment, the silence between us grew louder than any words ever could. That night, I decided to step out of the house to clear my head and calm myself. It was an old habit. When things didn't go right, when my thoughts scattered and my heart beat too loudly, I would go for a walk. The late hour transformed the town into something different, as if it wasn't our suburb, but a foreign territory where voices hushed and streetlights flickered in the wind. I stepped out through the gate and felt the cool air against my face. The crunch of small stones under my sneakers was almost a comforting ritual. I headed toward the park. It wasn't large, but it was dense. Old trees, benches known only to locals, and narrow winding paths between trunks made it a perfect retreat. I loved hiding in these alleys when I couldn't bear the pressure of the outside world or my own thoughts. The sound of footsteps behind me caught me off guard. At first, I thought it was a random passerby, someone heading home after a late shift or walking to the corner store. But when I turned, I saw a familiar figure. Daniel. He was following me, walking unhurriedly with his hands in his pockets. It felt strange to see him here, in a place I considered my private refuge. "Do you go running at night?" he asked softly as he drew closer. There was no mockery in his voice, just mild curiosity. I nodded, keeping my pace steady, careful not to sync my steps with his. But he walked beside me anyway, keeping half a step behind, as if observing me. I felt the tension rise instead of dissipating. Usually, the night air dissolved my worries, helping me reset. But now, everything was different. His presence wouldn't let me retreat into my inner world. The park was dark, the moonlight filtering through the thick canopy of leaves, casting fleeting shadows around us. In that dim light, I couldn't make out the expression on his face, but I could feel his gaze on me. We walked in silence, and with each passing minute, it thickened into something almost tangible. I couldn't understand why he was here. It seemed like he wanted to say something but hesitated. When we reached an old bench that I considered my secret spot, he suddenly stopped. I stopped too, looking at the outlines of the trees and the empty pond nearby. "Sometimes the night is the only time people take off their masks," he said, looking at me. I didn't know how to respond. His words sounded like a philosophical observation, but they struck something deep within me. It seemed he was still trying to figure me out, to see past my facade of composure. And me. Why was I silent? Maybe I wanted to understand him too. Daniel took a few steps toward the bench and sat down, gesturing for me to join him. I hesitated, but some inexplicable curiosity made me follow. We sat shoulder to shoulder under the stars, staring at the dark, mirror-like surface of the water reflecting the moonlight. His presence was almost hypnotic. There was no aggression, no trace of the irony that used to irritate me. This was a different person. Quiet, thoughtful, as if seeking a conversation but unsure where to start. "Are you afraid of plans falling apart?" he suddenly asked, his eyes fixed on the night sky. My heart tightened. The question echoed his words from the kitchen earlier. I realized he was deliberately trying to peel away my protective layers. The thought scared me, and yet it also drew me in. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, my voice soft, almost a whisper. There was something liberating in that confession. It surprised me that I was sharing this with him, someone I felt I should keep at arm's length. But here we were, and I couldn't look away from the moon's reflection in the lake. He didn't press further, didn't twist my words into something else. We sat there, listening to the rustle of leaves, the occasional drip of water, perhaps dew falling from the branches, and our own breathing. The nervous tension didn't vanish, but took on a strange new shade. I realized that now we both knew something about each other, though faint and undefined. It wasn't much, but it was enough to change everything. I woke early in the morning as soft light began to filter through the curtains. The night had brought no relief. I barely slept, and the few fleeting moments of rest were filled with hazy images, Stepping out of the house, I made my way slowly to the park. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could finally collect myself. I hoped the morning freshness, the rustle of leaves, and the scent of damp earth would help me regain balance. The park was deserted at this hour, with only the distant chirping of birds breaking the quiet. I found the familiar bench under the old linden tree, sat down, and tried to take deep breaths, willing the anxiety to leave me. I needed to sort myself out. Why was I letting Daniel affect me so much? Why did his questions make me feel so exposed, as though he was uncovering things I'd been afraid to admit even to myself? But as soon as I thought of him, he appeared. I heard the faint rustling of grass and footsteps on gravel. I didn't believe my ears until I looked up and saw him standing there. Daniel had found me again, in a place where he seemed not to belong. He stood a short distance away, arms crossed, with a determination in his expression that I hadn't seen before. "You're not what you seem," he said quietly, stepping closer. I felt my chest tighten. There was a note of candor in his voice that unsettled me more than aggression or mockery ever could. He sat down beside me. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel his presence. I didn't know whether to stay silent or to speak. Words that usually came easily now caught in my throat. "I've noticed it for a long time," he continued, tilting his head slightly as if studying me from a new angle. You try to be unshakable, like iron, but I can see you trembling inside, hiding it." His words left me uneasy. He spoke plainly, without games or his usual provocations. His tone was sharp, but not cruel. It was revealing a truth I was too scared to voice myself. "Why does it matter to you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice rasping as if I'd forgotten how to speak overnight. He tilted his head, thoughtful. It seemed like he, too, struggled to find the right words. "I don't know," he admitted, his eyes following a narrow beam of light breaking through the canopy. "Maybe because I'm looking for answers myself. Maybe because I'm tired of living with assumptions. Or maybe because, in your silence, I started finding something I didn't know I was missing." Every word of his felt strangely familiar, like an echo of my own doubts. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. And what was even more unsettling, some part of me agreed with him. We sat there in silence for several minutes, listening to each other's breaths and trying to grasp the shift that had taken place between us. He was no longer just my stepbrother, the intrusive, mildly irritating ironist. And I was no longer just a closed-off figure trapped in her own bubble. Between us, a thin thread had formed, taut with tension. It was a thread that could either be severed with a single sharp motion or carefully tugged to see where it might lead. "I don't want to pretend anymore." He finally broke the silence. "But if you don't need this, if it scares you, I'll stop." I spent the entire day trying to keep myself busy, hoping to forget the morning conversation with Daniel. I cleaned the house, cooked dinner, even sorted through old documents in the desk drawer. Anything to distract myself. But his words, his gaze, and the tone in which he said, "I don't want to pretend anymore," echoed inside me. As evening approached, I decided to cook something special. Perhaps it would distract us both. While I chopped vegetables, I felt him enter the kitchen. I didn't turn around, but his presence immediately filled the room. It was an odd sensation. Being near someone who said nothing yet had such a powerful effect on your inner state. Daniel sat at the table watching me. I heard the quiet creak of the chair under his weight and felt his gaze fixed on my movements. I kept chopping, trying not to reveal my thoughts, but my fingers trembled, and the knife moved across the board a bit faster than necessary. "You're different today," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft but firm, as if he knew his words would strike a chord. His face was calm, but his eyes carried that sharp perceptiveness that always unsettled me. "Different?" I repeated, trying to sound unaffected, but my voice wavered. "How could you tell?" He smiled, but it wasn't mocking. It was strange, almost melancholic. "You always try to keep your distance," he said, holding my gaze. "But today, it seems like even you don't know where that distance lies." I felt he was right, but I didn't want to admit it. Maybe I'm just tired, I replied, attempting to sound indifferent. People change, don't they? He didn't respond immediately. His silence was almost tangible, like a pause in music that makes you anxiously await the next note. Then he stood up, took a few steps toward me, and stopped at the kitchen island. We were suddenly very close, closer than I had anticipated. His presence felt almost physical. I just want to understand, he said softly, but there was something in his voice that made me wary. Why you never let yourself relax. Why you're afraid to let go. I didn't know what to say. It was as if he had pressed on a sore spot I was too scared to touch myself. Do you think it's that simple? I asked, feeling a surge of irritation mixed with confusion. You overanalyze everything, always digging into details. And now you want me to just… What? Let go? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. No, I don't want you to let go. I want you to be honest with yourself. At that moment, our hands brushed against each other. The touch was so unexpected that I froze. Daniel, I began, but he interrupted me, his tone quiet and gentle. Don't say anything if you're not ready. Just know this. I can't ignore it anymore. Neither of us can. You shouldn't… I started again, but he stopped me this time with a simple gesture, raising a finger to his lips as if asking for silence. Just think about it, he said before stepping away, leaving me standing in the middle of the kitchen with the chopped vegetables and the unsettling sense that my life would never be the same. When the door closed behind him, I took a deep breath, trying to collect myself, but his words kept ringing in my head. Be honest with yourself. As if it were that easy. When evening gave way to deep night, I decided to step out onto the balcony. It was quiet and cool, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something significant. The sky was astonishingly clear, with stars breaking through the darkness like bright patches of light. I leaned on the railing, trying to push away intrusive thoughts, but each one returned, echoing everything that had happened that day. I heard the door open behind me. The steps were light, but I immediately knew who it was. Daniel. He didn't ask to join me. He just walked over and leaned on the railing next to me. We stayed silent. The air between us was thick with tension, but neither of us dared to break it. I felt his gaze slide over me, but I didn't turn. The night was too fragile, and any sudden movement might shatter this strange equilibrium. I thought you'd be asleep, he finally said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. I can't, I replied, still looking at the stars. Too much on my mind. He didn't respond, but his silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with unspoken meanings. We stood there together as time seemed to slow. The cold wind swirled around us, but inside I felt like I was burning. Why are you afraid of me? He asked suddenly, his voice calm, almost as if he were stating a fact. I turned sharply toward him, ready to protest, but the words caught in my throat. His eyes met mine, piercing, perceptive, seeing right through me. That was what scared me the most. He saw everything, and I couldn't hide. I'm not afraid, I finally managed to say, but my voice faltered. It betrayed the uncertainty I couldn't suppress. Then why do you keep pulling away? He asked, stepping just a little closer, though still leaving enough space for me to retreat. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen, as if rooted to the spot. Because I don't know what to do with this, I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. The words spilled out before I could stop them, as if they'd been waiting deep inside, ready to escape. Daniel nodded, his gaze softening but remaining as intent as ever. Neither do I, he said. But I know one thing. I can't ignore it. Neither of us can. I froze. His words struck like lightning, tearing through the night. I couldn't ignore them. They were true. Everything happening between us was impossible to deny anymore. I tried to summon the strength to tell him we needed to stop, that it was wrong, that we should forget this. But those thoughts felt like lies because deep down I knew I'd already crossed the line. "You've become more to me than just a sister," he said, his voice trembling slightly as if afraid his words might shatter everything around us. His eyes shone in the starlight, and there wasn't a trace of mockery in them, only raw, unfiltered truth. The world stood still. The wind died. The night sounds faded, and all I felt was this moment. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I didn't know what to say. "Daniel," I began, but my voice broke and I fell silent. He waited, not rushing me, not pushing, just watching, allowing me to choose for myself. I took a deep breath, the cold air cutting through my lungs. "This is wrong," I finally said, but my words were shaky as if I was trying to convince not him, but myself. "Maybe," he replied, his voice steady and without doubt. "But what is right? Do you want to keep pretending nothing is happening? Can you live with that?" "You know it's true," he said softly. "You feel the same." And I realized he was right. The days following that night were strange. We both tried to act as if nothing had changed, as if everything was perfectly normal. But it wasn't. I noticed it in everything. In the way our hands brushed against each other during breakfast, or how his gaze lingered on me just a little too long. Each time, I felt a storm brewing inside me. I knew I had to stop it, to push him away, to set boundaries. One morning, we crossed paths in the kitchen. I quietly poured myself a cup of coffee, deliberately avoiding looking at him. But even without seeing him, I could feel his presence. It was as tangible as the aroma of coffee filling the room. He moved closer, and his hand accidentally brushed against mine as he reached for a cup. "You're too tense," he said softly, as if reading my thoughts. His voice was gentle, but there was something provocative in it. I looked up and met his eyes. They glimmered with that same dangerous spark I was beginning to recognize. "Maybe because you're always so close," I replied, attempting to keep my tone light, but I could hear the nervous edge in my voice. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual teasing grin. It was something different, almost contemplative. "Maybe it's because you don't want me to leave," he said, stepping just slightly closer. His words felt like a challenge, and my breath caught. "You shouldn't—" I started again, but he stopped me this time with a simple gesture, raising a finger to his lips as if asking for silence. I stepped back, placing my cup on the counter with more force than necessary. "Daniel, this is wrong," I said, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded unconvincing. "Maybe." I turned away, hoping to hide the flush spreading across my cheeks. I wanted to give up. I wanted to stop fighting. By evening, things only got harder. I tried to busy myself with chores, but everything seemed to remind me of him. I heard his footsteps upstairs, his voice while he was on the phone, even his soft laughter through the walls. Everything around me felt colored by his presence, and it was unbearable. Hoping for some relief, I decided to take a bath, thinking the hot water might help me relax. But just as I was about to step out of the bathroom, he appeared. This time, it wasn't by accident. He walked in as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and I froze, stunned by his boldness. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me, trembling slightly. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine," he said bluntly, his eyes locked on mine. His gaze was insistent but not harsh. It was the look of someone who had made up his mind. Consequences be damned. He leaned in slightly. "Tell me you don't feel the same," he whispered, his words landing like a command, like a challenge. I couldn't. I felt myself leaning closer, felt all the walls I had built in my mind crumble around me. Our lips met, and the world disappeared. The next morning, I woke up early. My head was buzzing as if the night hadn't brought even a shred of clarity. Everything that had happened played over and over in my mind, like a reel I couldn't rewind. I knew our decision to kiss wasn't random, but I also realized we were now on uncharted territory, and finding our way out would be harder than I could have imagined. Daniel was in the kitchen. I could hear him tinkering with the coffee maker, and somehow that mundane, everyday sound felt almost unbearable. He was no longer just my stepbrother, but I also didn't know who he had become to me. "Are you always this quiet in the mornings?" he said when he noticed me. His voice was gentle, but there was an underlying tone that made me feel even more exposed. "Today, I just don't know what to say," I replied, walking into the kitchen and sitting at the table. My head was down, my gaze fixed on the edge of the cup in front of me. I couldn't look at him, afraid I'd drown in his eyes again. "We can't pretend this didn't happen," he said finally. His voice was soft but firm. "But if you want to forget, I'll understand. Just be honest with me." "I can't forget it," I admitted, still not looking up. "But I don't know how to live with it either." He nodded as if he understood. "No one does. It's not something anyone teaches us. But maybe instead of trying to figure it all out, we just try to be honest with each other." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, not bothering to hide my fear or curiosity. "Let's go somewhere," he said, and there was an unexpected lightness in his voice. "Let's just leave, far from all of this. Let it be our day, where we don't owe anyone any explanations." We rode our bikes to a small lake outside of town. The road was long but surprisingly easy. The fresh air, the singing birds, and the empty paths created the illusion that the world belonged only to us. Daniel rode ahead, glancing back occasionally to make sure I wasn't falling behind. His smile was genuine, free of tension. When we reached the lake, I stopped at the shore, looking out over the water. It was calm and clear, mirroring everything swirling in my head. Daniel came closer, and I felt his hand rest on my shoulder. The touch was soft, comforting. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, not moving his hand. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it that I hadn't heard before. "Yes," I replied quietly. "But I'm afraid it'll ruin everything." "Ruin what?" he asked. "I don't know where this will take us," I admitted, "but I don't want to lose it."